Hello and welcome to our sixth podcast. I'm Linda, and here's Mike with a few words to start with, and then if I understand this correctly, we get to answer a viewer question.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. So, yeah, in this podcast series, we are exploring and discussing social threefolding, which is a proposal to decentralize and restructure society into three independent areas: the economy, the political rights state, and the free cultural life. So, Lindy and I, we are reading and discussing the main book on this subject, The Core Points of the Social Question, which was written by Rudolf Steiner in 1919. Now, Steiner believes that we must develop new ways of thinking to address our existing social dysfunction and bring about positive social change. But on the one hand, we must develop these new ways of thinking through an education system that is truly free and independent, part of the free and independent cultural life. And with this new thinking, we can then create new institutions, such as economic associations that we've been discussing. And then these new institutions will in turn support and develop our new social thinking. So last time in our fifth podcast, we explored more about economic associations. And an economic association is essentially a group of local producers, retailers, and consumers who are part of a larger network of associations that arise in a kind of bottom-up grassroots way to administer the economic life in a way that is completely independent of the state or of the government. So we can imagine delegates coming together from various economic groups, the producers, traders, consumers, as well as workers and capital owners, to voice their various different interests and consider what solutions might be possible to create healthy prices for everyone. Now, a healthy price is one that is high enough that allows producers to get their needs met, yet low enough so that the consumers can afford to get their needs met as well. So out of a collaborative judgment of these different representatives, supply is managed so that there's no overproduction or underproduction. And economic association is a way to bring reason into the otherwise chaotic free market system. So, and it also has no involvement of this from the state, from the government. So it's not a kind of cartel or other means for one group to exploit another, but instead everything is judged purely out of economic interests based on mutual advantage. And this allows the economic life to become fully independent of the government, which is a core point that is essential to a threefold society. Okay, does that work for you, Linda?
That works very well. Thank you, Mike. Now, are you ready to answer the
Yeah.
viewer question? Okay,
Okay. So,
I'll read it here. So it says, so about economic organizations, unlike for the weak and those who cannot contribute, what would stop the strong, someone who can contribute, from abusing this and not contributing, even if they have the means? And what advantage would there be to contribute rather than to just receive? Does Steiner give concrete step-by-step examples of the enforcement and incentive mechanisms an economic association would use if a capable member refuses to contribute? In other words, covering reputation effects, membership contracts, um, sanctions, fines, suspensions, exclusions, market access consequences, etc., and or how these could interact practically.
okay, thank you. I think it's clear this viewer has thought about this a lot. I would
It's a
say
very
this
good
question,
question.
yeah,
Yes.
it's a very central concern. I think a lot of people have this question, and so I can rephrase it. If a threefold society were to provide a cost of living support for people who are capable of working but choose not to work, right? So people who are capable of contributing to society in an economic sense, but choose not to,
Mhm.
how do we sort this out? I think that's the question here, right? And I'd say that Steiner did not describe any specific mechanisms for handling this. what he did was speak about rights consciousness. So people who have needs, everyone
Mhm.
has needs, but people's needs would be supported out of a consciousness of rights. But this cuts both ways because those who do contribute and work hard every day also have rights. And it seems fair out of the same rights consciousness that the hardworking people would, of course, also be entitled to receive what is fair, corresponding to their hard work and their contributions to their fellow human beings. So, the way I imagine it, at least, is that someone who's capable of working, who chooses not to work, would only receive a bare minimum standard of living, perhaps having a very small place to live, very few luxuries, and so on. And I think this is necessary so as not to take too much away from those who do work and contribute to society. So I don't think the line is fixed. I think it would be really up to each society to decide on this on a democratic basis. What is a fair minimum standard of living? Fair both to the person who doesn't contribute and also fair to the people who do. And this would be some number that would arise out of practical considerations. It would be high enough to preserve human dignity, yet low enough to ensure that people have an incentive to work. And so the whole economy doesn't just shut down, right? And if we imagine advancing technology with the development of AI and robots, it's likely that this minimum could rise over time if human labor becomes more and more voluntary.
Mhm.
That we are all kind of choosing to work if we have robots. Anyway, so these are some thoughts. I don't know if there's a
Mhm.
clear black and white answer.
Okay. I think it really does begin to paint a picture of what it might look like, and hopefully, as we go on, we'll sort of realize, okay, so there are many mechanisms maybe in play, and having a society that is really based on the rights consciousness that you're talking about, maybe we can, I'm sure we'll delve into that more and to understand that more so that that'll give us a better idea, probably. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think Steiner's idea about social threefolding is something fundamentally human. And he speaks about it not so much as a mechanism, but more like a social organism. So
Yes.
it's just like the body itself, what regulates our hormones, what regulates too much or too little food intake or activity, or all these things have their natural balances. And if we look at it as society as an organism, things will kind of sort themselves out. I think
Hmm.
that's the picture more than a mechanism.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, you've mentioned that before, and that's a
Yeah.
very important, I think, definition or differentiation between what you said before that if it's a mechanism, you can just take a piece out of it and replace it, but with the organism, you really can't take out your eye and just replace it with another eye. That was your analogy, I
Yeah.
remember. Okay.
Yeah. And also each person in society can't be just replaced with another person. I think
Yes.
this is the point.
Yes. I mean, well, there are some people that might think that that is the case, but really, when you look at each individual human, we're so different and we bring so many different aspects. Even if we are replacing the barber, for instance, we're going to bring our own uh, attributes and limitations and all of that to the job or whatever. But you're not, I don't think you're just talking about a job. You're
Yeah.
talking about,
Yeah, and when one person takes over the job of another, that person doesn't vanish. And they
mm,
still have a place. They're still in the society. So
yes,
there's still a lot to manage with the society. Okay?
right.
So
Thank
maybe
you.
we'll just that thanks, Linda. That's great. So let's move on, I think. Um maybe we'll cut to the screen share now because
Yep,
we'll go back to the book. Okay?
yep. Hmm.
All right. So last time we had read this paragraph at the bottom of page 18 that
Hmm.
starts just as in the free cultural life.
Yes.
And so just to recap where we're at in the book, we're towards the end of the preface of 1920, and we had
Hmm.
we had been talking about how, first of all, the The free cultural life must be governed by autonomous cultural groups. For example, teachers who also administer their own schools independently. And then we talked about the economic life, where the leadership and governance role is taken up by what Steiner calls economic associations. And as we just said, what each individual contributes in this paragraph, he says, arises out of the context of living together with others and seeing their needs. And if people are unable to contribute, that is, children, seniors, the disabled, and so on, this is discussed later in this book, he says.
Hmm.
And such people, he says at the end, will protect the weak against the strong. So the weak will be protected only if the economic life is shaped out of purely economic forces. So I'll just add a thought about this, that the economic life is really shaped by mutual advantage. And if we allow this mutual advantage to work, as opposed to things like power and class distinctions or other kinds of distinctions, then we have to kind of recognize that we all take turns, as it were. First, we are all children who need support for a couple of decades, plus or minus. And then we are adults and we become productive and we become supportive of others for a while. And then eventually we become seniors who retire and need support again. So, and also the fact that anyone can become disabled at any time. This is unpredictable
Hmm.
and maybe without warning. So we all have to recognize that purely for economic reasons, for out of pure mutual advantage, the strong must protect the weak because the wheel turns, we could say. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah,
So I would say this is what he's pointing to.
I
Yeah.
would say that's a very good and balanced way to actually look at this and not to sort of go down that, oh, I can take advantage of this person or that person because I can. Yeah,
Yeah. It's at one point it could be you. You don't know.
absolutely.
So we
Yeah,
create our own culture. We create our own society. What kind of society are we creating?
yes.
Yeah. All right. So I suggest we move on to the top of page 19 and we're going to finish the preface here in a few paragraphs. And I'll just warm up this next paragraph that starts, thus
Hmm.
the social organism. Notice he says organism, right? Not
Yes,
mechanism. So
yes.
I'm going to warm it up by saying, on the one hand, that we have this free and independent cultural life. On the other, we have this independent and collaborative life of economic associations. So each social area must be based entirely upon its own forces. And then in a third, a middle area must arise. And this is the life of rights. This is the government, the legal state. And this rights state focuses on what arises from the judgment and feeling of every adult citizen. So, whereas in the free cultural life, everyone participates according to their abilities, and in the economic life, according to their role within the associative context, now in the rights life, people participate according to what is purely human, independently of their education or their ability, and independently of what they might produce or consume. Okay, so why don't you
Hmm.
read that, please?
Sure. Thus, the social organism can break into two independent members, which support each other precisely because each has its own administration that arises from its unique forces. Between the two, however, a third must come to life, the proper governmental member of the social organisms. In this member, everything asserts itself that must be dependent on the judgment and feeling of every person who has reached the age of majority. In the free cultural life, everyone participates according to their particular abilities. In the economic life, everyone has a position that follows from their associative context. In the political legal life of the state, the individual comes into their own purely as a human insofar as this is independent of the abilities through which they can participate in the free cultural life. And regardless of the value of the goods they produce, through the associative economic life.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I would say Steiner is painting a picture here of this a new concept of government. We have such a picture. Our picture is really that government is really strongly tied to the economy. And
Hmm.
so when we think about government and we always think government is connected to the economy somehow, and to the extent it runs schools, it's also connected to the cultural life. And we think of the government as this whole big mass. And he's saying, now, what if we extract away the entire cultural life? We extract away the entire economic life. What is actually left? We have, I would say, a very small government left because if they have nothing to do with the economy, nothing to do with schools or hospitals or anything like that, what do they do? They're really just their job
Hmm.
is just limited to making laws, to law enforcement, maybe civil defense or military defense, and um, it's a very restricted rights life, a rights government. So we have to imagine something different than what we normally imagine here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm kind of curious about what he means by, let me just find the sentence. Everything asserts itself that must be dependent on the judgment and feeling of every person who has reached age of maturity. What does that mean? Judgment and feeling.
So I think his imagination is that in the last few centuries, maybe 2 centuries, or even really one and a half, we've really grown a lot in terms of democracies around the world. This
Hmm.
wasn't really something that existed even 300 years ago. And
Hmm.
so we have to imagine that now more and more the group of people who have reached the age of majority, so that means adults, in his imagination that children wouldn't necessarily have the right to vote until a certain age, whatever age that is.
Hmm.
Different countries may have different ages, but
Hmm.
whatever age that is, everyone in that group is considered an equal,
Hmm.
and everyone gets one vote. So you can
Hmm.
imagine this majority group is now making decisions based on their judgment and their
Hmm.
feelings. So
Hmm.
especially their feelings of rights consciousness. So
Hmm.
it's right if someone who commits a crime is punished, let's say.
Hmm.
Or maybe another society might decide that if someone commits a crime, they should be forgiven. I don't know what. But whatever
Yeah.
it is that people judge
Hmm.
and however they feel,
Hmm.
this is the basis for law in that society.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
And
That's
this is
okay.
fundamentally what the rights state is about,
Okay.
not the economy, not schools and hospitals, and just
Right.
that.
Okay. So who would be taking care of the schools? I'm sorry, not the schools. That's this cultural life. But who would be taking care of, say, road works and stuff
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in chapter 2, but
Okay.
as you asked, because you ask it, Steiner imagined that. So I'll just preface by saying we have a kind of one of the old thinking that we need to change into new thinking
Hmm.
is a kind of false distinction between the private sector and the public sector.
Hmm.
So we always think the private sector is the economy and the public sector is the government. But I
Hmm.
don't think Steiner thinks this way.
Hmm.
So imagine that a private sector could be um, something like he had a different imagination about ownership, we'll say. And so when you ask the question, who owns the roads or the post office or bridges and things like that, it really is everyone, right? The whole society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the government deals with it, yeah? So
Hmm.
so the government is only focused on the rights life, isn't
Okay.
necessarily focused on roads and bridges. So I think his imagination is that that would move to the economic associations to manage,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
some kind of economic body that is public. It's part of the economy. It's public, just not part of the government.
Got it. Okay.
So I'll
Okay.
say
Interesting.
that for now.
Thank you.
So we
Thanks
have to
for.
let go of our old ideas about private sector, public sector, to think differently about economic life, rights life, cultural life.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Anything else before we move on?
That was my question for today.
Good.
For this,
So for
not
the
for
whole
today.
day, awesome. We're done. Okay, wrap. That's a wrap. Cut. All right. So let's go on to the next little paragraph, and it
Okay.
starts in this book. Okay. So this is a
Yeah.
short little paragraph, and he basically says he's we're still reading the preface, remember? So he's introducing the
Mhm.
book, and he says we will also be talking about labor and specifically labor regulations. And this is going to be considered a political legal matter. So within the rights life, everyone is equal and everyone decides together as equals things like labor entitlements and labor obligations. And furthermore, in the rights life, only those matters that can be decided by equals are decided.
Mhm.
Okay, so why don't you read that?
Sure. In this book, it will be shown how labor, in terms of amount and kind, is a matter of this political legal state life. Within this state life, everyone faces each other as an equal, because here only those areas are negotiated and administered in which each person is equally capable of judgment. The rights and obligations of people are regulated within this member of the social organism.
And so this actually goes back to our viewer question because this question of where to find the line between supporting someone who can't work or is doesn't want to work versus, what share should go to those who do work and contribute. This is a rights question. This is a matter
Mhm,
of the rights life to decide.
mhm,
That
mhm,
everyone should decide together. And it's
mhm,
kind of my imagination is, you vote for something, disabled people should get this. But then who knows, maybe the wheel turns and you become a disabled person in the future.
mhm.
And so you have to think, what if this were me all the time, right?
Right,
So
right.
I think each person is capable of this judgment as an
Mhm,
equal.
mhm, mhm.
And it's not really dependent on how wealthy you are, what class you belong to, socioeconomic class, if you're,
Right,
how educated you are. It's really, these are the things that every human being can decide together equally.
right. Okay.
And if
And
it's and if it's a question that can't be decided by equals, then it probably belongs to either the cultural life or the economic life.
that was my next question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, that's good. You preempted it. Yeah, very good. Thank you.
So if it's a matter of should we produce more eggs, I think this is a question that isn't really a democratic decision. It's more like the people who are involved in egg production can decide that.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
People that know
Yeah.
the question better.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay.
Okay,
Yep.
shall we move on?
Let's move on.
So the last paragraph on this page, 19, to warm it up, Steiner is going to be talking about how through the independent unfolding of each of the three social members, the unity of the whole threefold society will arise. So this book will discuss how, through the collaboration of all three members, how land and capital can be managed, owned, and utilized. This book approaches social problems from a practical perspective based on real life alliances of people who dedicate themselves to tackling social challenges.
Mhm.
Okay,
Thank you. All right. So you want me to read?
that'd be great.
So, the unity of the entire social organism will arise from the independent unfolding of its three members. This book will show how the effectiveness of movable capital, the means of production, and the use of land can be shaped through the collaboration of the three members. Anyone who wants to solve the social question by some invented or otherwise created economic approach will not find this book practical. Anyone who, out of life experience, wants to encourage people to form such kinds of alliances in which they can best recognize social challenges and dedicate themselves to these will perhaps not deny that the author of this book strives for truly practical life.
So any thoughts about this?
And I'd like to kind of see it come together in my own mind. I mean, I'm sort of getting pieces of it from reading the preface. But I'm sort of interested and intrigued. How does this come together? Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. And so we have to imagine that the basic idea is to separate economy, the right state, and the cultural life from each other. But then
Hmm.
each of these, if they're separated, how do they work together? And they really come together, Steiner will go on to say at the end of chapter 2, because each of us are human beings who participate in all three. So each of us are going to be the unifying factor. So we are going to bring it all together. So so we shouldn't fear the separation.
Mm,
We will be able to bring it together again,
right.
right?
Huh. This kind of reminds me of as philosophy of freedom sort of piece where we are the key ingredient that brings all the worlds together. So he's doing that in a threefold society. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And in I'm just trying to think in lecture, I think it's lecture 4 of the social future lectures, he actually says that social threefolding is a continuation um of his book, The Philosophy of Freedom,
Hmm.
expanded into the social life.
Okay.
And
There you
because
go.
the philosophy of freedom is fundamentally about human freedom, the inner becoming inwardly free. And now if we bring that into the social life and make freedom the foundation of society, then we have social threefolding.
Right. Got it.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. So let's this last this last page 20, there's 3 little paragraphs. Let's read these together as a chunk
Hmm.
because he's just finishing up his preface.
Yep.
And he's going to say that since this book, so he's writing this preface a year after he had originally published it. And he's saying that since the book was first published in April 1919, Steiner has written a lot of supplementary articles. And these were now, at the time of publishing the preface, put together and bound into a separate volume called The Renewal of the Social Organism, which is Collected Works number 24. So now he's got 2 books, and both of these books, the book we're reading and the other book, focus on practical steps that must be taken in social life. Things are not articulated, Steiner says, in a clear abstract form because life itself is fluid and diverse. Life requires fluid, adaptable thinking, and social challenges can only be addressed through such thinking. So if you would read that, please.
Sure. This book was first published in April 1919. I have given supplements to what was said at the time in the articles that were contained in the magazine Threefolding of the Social Organism, which have just been published together as the book The Renewal of the Social Organism. We will find that both books speak less about the goals of the social movement and instead about the pathways that ought to be taken in social life. Anyone who thinks based on practical life knows how individual goals in particular can appear in different forms. Only to someone who lives in abstract thoughts does everything appear in clear outlines. Such a person often criticizes the practical aspects of life because they do not find these defined or presented clearly enough. Many people who see themselves as practical are just as abstract thinkers. They do not consider that life can take on the most diverse shapes. Life is a flowing element, and anyone who wants to go with it must also adapt their thoughts and feelings to this basic flowing pattern. The social challenges can only be taken hold of with such thinking. The ideas of this book have been won from the observation of life. From this, too, they want to be understood.
Okay. So
Yeah.
he closes his preface with this emphasis on the life. And the living nature of organisms, the social organism, but also you think of the diversity of biological organisms, all the different plants and animals. I mean, it's a huge diversity in time, not just what's alive today, but things that have gone extinct. There's a huge diversity of life. And so he doesn't want us to think just in narrow terms about society either. We could imagine many different forms of social organisms, in this part of the world or in this point in time. And so he wants us to have a very dynamic way of thinking about this.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that's why it's so important to me when we talk, don't, some people use this word sphere, they say the economic sphere and so on. I'm very much against that. Steiner never used the word sphere. He always says the economic life, the rights life, the cultural
Hmm.
life. And this is what I use as well because I want to keep emphasizing this living element. It's not just a sphere, it's not a marble or a lump, right? This is a
Hmm.
mechanistic, materialistic way of thinking. And I think if we use the right language of cultural life and so on, we will be able to have a more living, we'll activate our living thinking about this.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So that's
I can see
important.
that. Okay. Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Is there anything else we want to say before we go on?
No, no, I'm good.
Okay. So this brings us to the end of the preface of 1920. And now
Hmm.
we are ready, believe it or not, to start chapter one, the actual book. Yeah. After our sixth podcast, we're now starting the book. But that's good. That's fine. We're on track. I want to say maybe I'll say a few words about what chapter one is about,
Hmm.
and then we can dive into the first paragraph. Okay. So
Sounds good.
I'll preface the chapter as a whole.
Hmm.
So this chapter really considers how the social question has not really been understood in its true form. So superficially, the social question seems to be about a socioeconomic struggle between the working class and the capitalist or the ruling classes. But a deeper analysis, he goes on to say in this chapter, a deeper analysis reveals, perhaps surprisingly, what that the real issue has less to do with what people think and more to do with how they think. So, for historical reasons, the thinking of the working class in particular has become an ideology, something purely intellectual. And this in turn resulted because our cultural life, our life of education and individual abilities remains unfree because our cultural life has become harnessed to state and economic interests. And social dissatisfaction in our times is, in fact, rooted in the unfree quality of the cultural life. And so the liberation of the cultural life is, in fact, what will lead to the unfolding of human dignity, much more than any changes in external economic circumstances. The forces of the economic life are such that it converts everything into a good or a commodity. And when labor is treated as something economic, then labor likewise becomes a good that can be bought and sold. And this is called, we even say, wage slavery today. So this wage slavery and the corresponding loss of dignity will only end once labor as such is removed from the economic life. And so the social question in its true form, which is the title of this chapter, right? The true form of the social question. The true form is really three questions. One, how do we liberate the independent cultural life? Two, how do we treat labor as part of the rights life? And three, how ought the economic life function within the context of human community? Okay, so that's a very dense summary. We'll spend some time going through this chapter, but that gives
Sure.
you a picture of where we're going with this. Okay?
Yes. Yeah.
Any comments to start with?
Well, I mean, these are subject matters that he's kind of touched on in the preface, so I'm glad to have read the preface, but obviously there's a more in-depth sort of explanation in all of this. So Very interested to sort of have a deeper understanding and how to change my own thinking around this. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I'm gonna add though, chapter one, the true form of the social question really focuses on the social question of 1919 era.
Hmm.
We don't really think of things in the same way. There's a little bit of historical background that we need to understand this chapter, but at the same time, I think we can try to work as we go through it, also dig up some more modern or current relationships that he's talking about behind, because of course he lived a century ago. So,
Yeah.
but I think it's still relevant. So we'll talk about
Mhm.
that as we go along. Okay. So let's
Okay.
let's start. It starts with a very short little paragraph, and this paragraph begins basically he's saying when we look at the social movement that has arisen in the wake of World War One, do we not have before us the concrete evidence that proves that our social thinking is inadequate? Okay, so if you could read
Hmm.
that, please.
Chapter 1: The True Form of the Social Question. Does the modern social movement arising from the catastrophe of the World War not reveal itself through facts that prove the inadequacy of those ideas that people believed for decades would allow them to understand the proletarian will?
Yeah, that there's a lot of things here in this paragraph to look at. He's talking about immediately in 1919, right after World War One.
Hmm.
And so we could maybe just call to mind that historical situation that this is when the book was published and people were reading it with this in mind, right?
Hmm.
The first people reading it. And so he basically is saying that there's a lot of social unrest at the time. And he's saying, doesn't this social unrest point to the fact that the ideas that people had were inadequate? What they thought that would allow them to understand the proletarian will, which means the will of the working class, um, these ideas weren't really adequate. So he's pointing in the first paragraph to maybe we have to rethink how we think. Yeah. And I think this is true today. We have this tendency to think, oh, this person or this group, we don't like them because they're doing things that we don't agree with. But we don't really question, maybe it's our whole thinking, our social thinking
Hmm.
that's maybe inadequate to the task of our times.
Hmm.
We have to ask that question. Maybe our whole idea set is flawed,
Right.
right?
Yes.
So this is setting the tone for the chapter.
Hmm.
Okay. So the
Yes.
second paragraph, he goes on, he basically is saying that the current demands of the working class, the proletariat, yeah, as well as other facts, give us cause to ask whether our thinking might be inadequate. The powers that previously suppressed what we see today as demands of the working class have now been partially destroyed, making it plain how these demands, based as they are on deeper impulses, are truly indestructible. So if you could read that,
Mm.
please.
Sure. That which is currently pressing to the surface of life from previously suppressed demands of the proletariat and related issues makes it necessary to ask this question. The powers that brought about this suppression have been partly destroyed. The relation these powers have established with the social driving forces of a large part of humanity can only be willingly maintained by those who are completely unaware of how indestructible such impulses of human nature are.
Okay. So I
Mm.
think again in the historical context of the time, but even today, we can sort of imagine how is a certain kind of repression. The society, the structuring of society represses what is really living in people. And there are certain moments where this is maybe set aside and the sort of cracks develop that allow people to express this suppressed impulse. It comes to the surface. And I think what he's saying is the whole question of the way of thinking can't really be a matter of suppressing something that is what he calls indestructible. That there's something about human nature that is struggling and fighting to assert itself.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's the structures of society will eventually have to give way to these impulses.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And I think this
Okay.
is true today.
Hmm.
What do you think, Linda?
Yeah, I mean, there are several things that come to mind. I mean, I'm just sort of trying to put myself in the shoes of who's just come out of World War One, where it was n really they were kind of at that time saying never again, one would wish. But, the fact that a world war had come, I would imagine would have sort of sh shaken people to the core. I don't think that anyone had ever experienced, if I understand history, as my teachers have taught me in the past, that this was something like unlike anything any human being had experienced, and the just the struggles, and I mean, being sort of really obvious, uh, an evidence of, yeah, something is not right. Something is not um, being addressed. And definitely, you know, people were repressed, are being repressed even today. I see elements of similar things, people's systems being feeling shocked, and anytime that there's a new war declared, or just the outrage and the outright just horror of that. And like, what makes that necessary? Like, in today's sort of, like, it's obviously a deep sort of dissatisfaction, of the way things are. I would venture to say one of the um, one of the explanations for that. So the power imbalance, and one being the suppressors and the other being the suppressed. It's not healthy. It's not something that one would aspire to, but we've kind of managed to make it look a little bit more shiny in the Western world, certainly, and in modern times. But it really literally is labor, being sort of being slave labor, in some circumstances.
Yeah, and specifically, I think Steiner is pointing to something that to the reader of 1919 is very obvious. We might not be so clear about it, but he was talking about Marxism and the
Yes.
rise of the class consciousness, and that
Hmm.
people were, this was the time, even just in the middle of the war in 1917, there were these two Russian revolutions that brought about the new Russian Empire and the communist revolutions. So
Hmm.
people were looking for a break from capitalist society. They wanted a new way of doing things that was more human. They wanted, maybe it didn't work out that way, but at least that's what they wanted. And I think people were really strongly feeling that they're, like you said, the indignity of the labor situation, the capital labor imbalance, the class war, there's so many things that people felt were unfree and undignified about their life. It's just a long laundry list. And so, um, people rose up at the time, and there was people were fighting in the streets in Germany around, like, people reading this book at the time would be aware of all that was going on. And
Hmm.
so he's speaking to this and saying these are impulses of the human nature that are sort of rising to the surface. There are these sort of moments when their cracks develop and these things start to become visible, and then they're not always visible. And I'm just
Mhm.
saying, if we look back over the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, we can see some of these cracks. At times, there's a crack, and then you see some of these impulses bursting forth.
Mhm.
I won't go into a long list of them. We can all imagine different things, but there's
Mhm.
literally, dozens or hundreds of these cracks and
Mhm.
all over the world. And so it's this impulse. There's something living in the human being that is not satisfied and that keeps getting repressed, but you can't really stop it. That's what he's saying, I think.
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is social threefolding. Social
Right.
threefolding is the answer to this.
Mhm.
All right, should we read a little more?
Yes, please.
So, in the next paragraph at the bottom of the page, we're on 23.
Mhm.
He another little paragraph. He says basically that in influential individualities within the ruling classes, they did not understand these deeper impulses of the working class. They thought at the time that a military victory would consolidate and bring about unity, and that would calm the social storms. But in fact, the opposite occurred, and their failure to win World War I only fanned the flames of social unrest. And
Mhm.
now the ruling classes have no choice but to act in accordance with what is demanded by the socialists and the social democrats who gained so much strength at this time.
Mhm.
So we can
Mhm.
read that, please.
Sure. Some personalities whose life situation made it possible for them, through their words or advice, to inhibit or encourage the forces of European life that led to the war catastrophe in 1914, indulged in the greatest illusions about these driving forces. They were able to believe that a military victory for their country would calm the social storms. Such personalities had to become aware that it was through the consequences of their behavior that these social drives first came fully apparent. Indeed, it turns out that the current human catastrophe was the historical event through which these drives gained their full power. During the recent fateful years, the leading personalities and classes had to make their behavior always dependent on what lived in the socialist-minded circles of humanity. Often they would have liked to have acted differently had they been able to ignore the mood of these circles. The effects of this mood live on in the form that events have currently taken.
Okay. So this is again a very strong historical reference to events at the time.
Mhm.
And again, just to sort of flesh it out a bit, you have these forces of socialism coming up. And in Russia they became a full-blown national transformation. But in Germany they were just as strong. There was the German Socialist Revolution was happening at the time, and it was being put down militarily by the government of the time. And so they used quite violent means to shut down any dissent in Germany and prevent the same thing happening in Germany that happened in Russia. But there was a strong element of discontent. And I think what he's saying is that these people have to bend a little bit. The capitalist class, the ruling classes, had to eventually bend to the will of these socialists, and even if they didn't like it. And so we see at the time, and especially in the 1930s, the rise of a lot of socialist forms, like reforms, I should say, a
Mhm.
lot of things like worker laws, labor laws, I mean,
Mhm.
a lot of welfare laws, and a whole bunch of innovations that came because of the power of these socialist movements. And this really carried on from the 30s up really up until the 80s. It was sort of continuous growth of civil rights that we saw across the world
Mhm.
in many countries, and the rise of democratic powers, the rise of workers' rights, the a better standard of living for most people. It was a real sea change in that
Mhm.
time that followed,
Mhm.
right? And this was really driven by these socialist-minded people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say, looking back around the Reagan Thatcher period, you saw this reversal that there was a change back, handing power back to the ruling classes, to the right wing. And so since then, in the last, what, I guess it's 50 years, 40 years, we've
Hmm.
seen more of a reversal that the right wing has taken up power again. So we
Hmm.
had the kind of period of left wing power in the most of the 20th century, and then that's now shifting back again. So we
Hmm.
see these oscillations between the left wing having the upper hand, the right wing having the upper hand,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
so we're kind of caught. And I think what Steiner's pointing to is something beyond this, that beyond the struggle between labor and capital, how can we see something that resolves this conflict and not just perpetuates this conflict?
Right. I mean, based on what conversations that I'm having recently around this, that, the recognition that neither really has a good answer for us, right? And the dissatisfaction to this day, you kind of look to labor to be sort of inclusive of everyone and be fair and all of that, but then you see all kinds of, I don't know, ideologies or whatever that, don't really um, in, aren't really inclusive. They become sort of more like this group or that group, and they pit each other against each other. And then in the conservative world, you're looking for, I guess, prosperity and understanding and, you know, um, I don't know, productivity and whatever the idea. And that they're kind of these two sides to almost the same coin. And it feels like it's rampant with corruption on whichever side that you take. And if you take a real sort of, if you're co-opted, if your mind is co-opted by the propagandas of whichever side, you're like in this forever sort of emotional um, distress, right? And we've had a lot of stuff that has happened in the last decade or so, or more than that, for sure, that causes people to really not know where to look and how there is that dissatisfaction that I can feel today. It's not just 100 years ago. I see it in people today. So what he's talking about, maybe historically, is 100 years ago, but it really is living today, is what I'm trying to say.
Yep. And it's exactly what he said at the end of the previous paragraph. These are indestructible impulses. These are not going away. We if
Hmm.
we don't do something, we look back 100 years in the future, we'll look back on now, and it'll be the same commentary. Well,
Hmm.
we have to find a way. It's not that it's a matter of which one-sided view is right. They both have elements of correctness to them, right?
Hmm.
They're both they both have an element of truth, but they're just
Hmm.
both one-sided.
Hmm.
The one views things through the lens of the worker and the working class and the labor, and that's a legitimate point of view. And the other one looks at society through the lens of capital and wealth, and that's also a legitimate point of view. But they seem to be fighting who's the legitimate point of view, and actually they're both legitimate. We just have to find a way to resolve this and find a kind of way forward. And Steiner's suggestion, of course, is to make a society threefold. This is the way forward. Because as long as they're blended together, we will never resolve anything. This is his view.
I think that's a pretty strong statement right there. And hey, if this really truly is something that, I mean, because something is not okay, that is for sure. And that is a very strong statement. And hey, if this educating ourselves and really creating a different kind of thinking that opens us out to really taking the best of all worlds and amalgamating that and creating this organism, and if it would create such I guess a fair society. where the weak and the strong are really taken into consideration, and everyone's life being of equal value in terms of, you are precious no matter what. You are human and you're precious, and we're going to take care of you, and I'm going to take care of you, and I know that you will take care of me when I need to. What a beautiful society that could be, you know? Yeah.
And Steiner's pictures, we kind of carve out these three separate areas. We make three independent areas
Hmm.
in which the economic life can have its own life of its own. And that's where the powers of capital play themselves out, the powers of, productivity and efficiency. And then we have a completely opposite pole of the cultural life. And this is the life of abilities, this is skills, this is capacities, this is education, training, and learning. Each of us has our unique contributions to make.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's a separate sort of space. And then, as you said, in the middle is this rights life that kind of mediates the two, that kind of finds this healthy relationship where each human being is considered an equal. And
Hmm.
you can't just do it with two opposing poles. You need this third, is what his point is. You
Hmm.
can't just have these like a pendulum swinging from labor to capital to labor to capital. You need something to kind of balance it in the middle,
Hmm.
a third space. And so by social threefolding will hopefully present a way forward out of this
Hmm.
confusion.
Yeah, and I think that, again, as a social organism and knowing humanity at this moment in time, that anything that we sort of set up, there's always there's always somebody looking to for ways of corrupting. There's always that aspect, and so I'm curious to see how that would be, I mean, when he's talking about it as a social organism, and really fluid, and societies and people coming together in these associations or the rights life or whatever, to really see what is happening in their community, because they can see what, how their lives are being, um, I guess, influenced, enhanced, or whatever, and the decisions need to be each community, for them, for their belief systems and their feelings and their judgments, rather than this whole big sort of overall, like, this is how you're going to do it. Well, it might not fit with that culture, or that system. Okay,
Yeah, so these are the topics that we will look at in the next episodes of our podcast. We will come to all these questions. So
very cool.
look forward to our next episode.
As do I.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, well, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
All right.
Okay,
Bye.
bye. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit like and subscribe.